Bloober Team are one of those developers that have really had an interesting trajectory path throughout the years. I mean, they started out with horror walking simulators with Layers of Fear, Observer, and Blair Witch, and it wasn't even until recently, I'd argue, that they really found their full stride. With 2021's Medium, and then the most recent Silent Hill 2 remake that came out last year, which was by far their best game to date. Well, here they are back yet again in 2025 with Cronos: The New Dawn. Another survival horror game proving again that these guys really like horror, along with setting their games in Poland, with a story here centering around an alternate version of 1980s Krakow. After there's been like an event which has infected all the citizens and turned them into monsters called orphans. Yeah, I don't know, if nothing else, just an excuse to have another game using retro futurism as its art style, which as history has shown us is truly one of the best aesthetics. And thanks to Bloober, I've been sent an early preview code letting me play through the first 2 or so hours of the main story. Also too worth mentioning in that this isn't a sponsored video either, okay? I was just sent a code and given free reign. Got it? Good. Right, so the premise is you're playing as the Traveler, a very female-sounding character working for an organization called the Collective, sent back in time to Poland to make sense of what's happened, tasked with first just trying to locate your predecessor.
Traveler ND3576, initiating the travel log.
Starting off with a weird sequence where you're asked a bunch of ambiguous philosophical questions. Even though the weirdest thing for me, and look, I don't know if I'm just projecting here, is how the helmet of your character kind of looks like a certain part of the female anatomy.
Dolores!
Whether or not that's intentional or something I should see a therapist about, I've got no idea. But considering the game opens with a literal Rorschach test, I don't think it's outside the realm of possibility. You know, that there's gonna be a whole lot of symbolism in this game. Anyway, nothing much else is explained in this intro sequence, outside of you just being given your basic goals and objectives. You do get your first weapon though, something called a shift blade, which kind of looks like a pistol, but then also morphs into what's more or less a knuckle duster, serving as both your ranged and melee option. Though I don't really advise using melee, because melee attacks seem to hurt someone as much as hitting them with a chicken nugget.
Your ass, bitch!
Anyway, soon after that, you blast your way out of this giant metal tomb and set off, having to then get through this short tutorial sequence, because developers still assume that the average gamer needs to be told which buttons correspond to movement. Not to mention, this game also features boxes and crates with yellow paint, which certain people on the internet absolutely love to hear themselves complain about, ignoring the fact that developers added the yellow paint in there for a reason. I will say as well that the atmosphere during all of this is off to a pretty good start, definitely capturing that lonely, eerie vibe of a post-apocalyptic Poland. You got a sequence inside a building with a bunch of creepy looking mannequins here too, which is classic. It introduces the manual save points, and there's even an audio log to listen to which gives away a crucial door code.
The code is 367.
So it's doing a pretty good job of getting you up to speed with all of the base mechanics in a completely low threat environment, you know, as it should. Followed expectedly by your first enemy encounter in a sequence which, if I'm honest, does feel like it comes a bit out of nowhere, and also making me notice that it takes a concerning amount of bullets to kill this thing. The first obstacle to get out of this area requires you to find 2 fuses to power the door that's blocking the exit. And even that, you know, it's like power fuses and survival horror. It's like peanut butter and jelly. And I feel at this point, the best way I'd sum things up early on here is that it's kind of like Dead Space meets Metro 2033. I mean, you got the survival horror and the science fiction aspect of something like Dead Space, playing as someone covered head to toe in futuristic armor, and then lugging yourself around in what looks and feels like a diving suit. You've even got the very Dead Space looking melee swing and stomp, though sadly the stomp move in this is a lot less effective, failing to turn enemy corpses into item piñatas. Then all combined with that apocalyptic theme of something like Metro 2033, where you're set foot into a civilization that's completely crumbled. It's just instead of that Eastern European setting of Moscow, it's the Central European setting of Poland.
You have my curiosity, but now you have my attention.
And also too, unlike Bloober's earlier more linear games, this is also way more in line to what they did with Silent Hill 2, in how the environments offers up a lot of distractions, in case you want to spend that extra time to run off and get much needed extra resources. You got a pretty nifty little crafting system here too, either using chemicals or metal parts to craft ammo or health items on the fly. And then all of the player upgrades are done by using energy you find throughout the environments, where annoyingly, instead of making the pickups worth more and having less of them, they've instead opted to make pickups worth bugger all and then put a couple of dozen of them throughout the levels. Anyway, there's another few enemy encounters here early on too, which was really starting to make me notice how slow and clunky the movement feels as well. You're not perfectly timing parries with your melee weapon to throw enemies off balance or any of that kind of shit either. And it feels like purposefully old school survival horror in that regard, in a good way. Where you're just some big lumbering asshole covered in armor. Though I would absolutely murder someone just to get a 180-degree spin move so I could quickly turn around. I mean, I think that should be the norm in every third-person shooter, man, especially survival horror. At this point, I really did start to notice too how my gun really wasn't doing that much damage, before I then remembered that this can also be charged up for more powerful shots. Yeah, remember that bit during the prologue where the game has you charge up your pistol to shoot your way out of this pod? Yeah, because apparently that's all the direction it gives you and that this mechanic exists. And yeah, dog, like it's pretty damn crucial because charged up shots make the enemies go down a lot quicker. It seems in about 2 or 3 headshots as opposed to 5 or 6. To the point that there's really no reason to not charge up every single shot when you're taking on enemies. There's also the idea introduced here where the orphans can absorb dead bodies to then mutate into more powerful variants. Which, is a cool concept, and it kind of does tie into this other mechanic you get shortly after this, where you can burn biomass with a flamethrower that's built into your suit. Which is also crucial to burning nearby enemy corpses to prevent this. And I guess it's supposed to be like that mechanic in the Resident Evil remake where you had to burn bodies or the zombies would reanimate into crimson heads later on. Only in that instance you had a finite amount of fuel, so you had to carefully choose which corpses you wanted to burn, pretty much based off whether or not you'd be returning to that area. Here in Cronos though, it's more or less a mechanic you have to do, unless you want the enemy to just become artificially stronger. And then the way it's handled is kinda weird because you only get one charge at a time, but then the game always puts these stations nearby which respawn infinite charges. Meaning you kinda just end up running back and forth to this thing as you try to clear out every corpse in the area. But hold on to that thought because I want to rant about it a bit more when I come back to it in a couple of minutes. Right, so it's not too long after this that we finally end up finding the dead body of our predecessor, who's got this anchor item, which is something we're going to need later on. Oh yeah, and I'm going to take a bold stab in the dark here that this predecessor is absolutely going to be an alternate version of the player from, like, a different timeline or whatever.
I will carry on where you left off.
We also get a new gadget here called an emitter, which can mess around with anomalies and shift the environment around in some pretty neat ways. Because it seems someone at Bloober Team either played Singularity, Titanfall 2, or both.
It can be used to manipulate the oddities.
None of which is like super challenging by the way, and always required to progress onward. What follows is a bunch of combat sequences against the enemies, including a new faster variant that runs towards you but thankfully has less health. And yeah, man, thank God someone left all these conveniently placed explosive propane tanks lying around, or else I'd have a real tough time trying to get past all of this. Along with there being a few more anomaly sequences here as well, which I started to realize is about the closest thing we get here to any actual puzzles. Even though puzzle isn't really quite the right word. Unless you consider it challenging and mind-bending to aim at something and press the control button. Shortly after this though is where I find the shotgun, what the game calls the hammer, which is one of the all-time best survival horror weapon tropes, and really one that does kind of make or break this genre.
It will help gain an advantage in close quarters.
I also get to see this main area that I'm trying to reach off there in the distance, an apartment complex that also seems to be the epicenter for another massive anomaly. Good visual direction too, man, with this building that looks like it's got a giant hemorrhoid on it that's ripping apart the fabric of reality. I've got it. But before I can get there, the floor falls out from beneath me, and I'm stuck in a basement area with walls that are all covered in bodily fluids and biomass. Yeah, kind of like your mum's bedroom on a Saturday night. The good news, though, is that I can finally test out the shotgun, and yeah, here we go. Oh, that's disappointing. All right, well, what about the charged up shot? Yeah, all right, that's better, I guess, maybe? Or am I really just so spoiled from playing things like Resident Evil 4 that I assume every single shotgun in a horror game should be the same elk? Am I really that out of touch? Oh, and it was at this point as well that I got stuck in the floor and couldn't fucking move, falling victim to my first death in the playthrough, which wasn't even really my fault. But you know what? I'm going to chalk this one up to just bad luck, considering it never happened ever again in the entire demo. The other thing is that this area really highlights all the problems you kind of get with this whole corpse merging mechanic. Because in this sequence, you're trapped in this small area, and then ambushed by like half a dozen or so enemies that come out of the walls. And unless you're going to be burning every single corpse as you go along here, which, let's be honest, you're not going to be able to, well then you're just giving all the other enemies carte blanche to keep mutating. I mean, it got to the point there where one of these things was so mutated that it used up all of my ammo, and in the end, I had to melee it just to finish it off. What it seems like they want you to do here is bait them around the area and then use these explosive tanks to take them out, which is fine, but that's still not going to stop them from mutating. It kind of reminds me of the Goliaths in Borderlands 2 and how those things would just become insanely powerful if they got to level up, which is kind of what's happening here. The only difference is that in Borderlands, you could control this by not shooting them in the head. Plus, there was like a risk-reward factor to it as well, because the tougher variants would drop better loot. But here though in Cronos, it just feels like a mechanic that artificially toughens these enemies up. I don't know, if nothing else, at least on a positive note, you can interrupt the process, but even still, man, like this whole idea, I can see being a real pain in the ass there later on. Anyway, after this, I'm in this huge opened up outdoor area that looks like some kind of courtyard, which is full of more explosive tanks, which you just know is going to be put to use in the very near future. Kind of reminds me of playing games back in the mid-2000s when you'd enter an area and then see a heap of waist-high cover strewn all over the place. And you just knew that it was going to absolutely be a new combat arena. Oh yeah, I love this bit here too when I go over into this side area to get some ammo, only to then be ambushed from behind by an enemy and use up the ammo I just collected. Classic. And yeah, look, more conveniently placed explosive tanks near where the enemies spawn in. I soon make it to the apartment complex, a very Silent Hill looking apartment complex too, by the way. You know, looking like I've just stepped over into the other world. And it seems the goal at this point is to ride the elevator to get to the top floor, but the elevator is all covered up in chains. So I need to get a key to the tool store, which is somewhere inside the building, and then use that item at the tool store to get me into the elevator. Right. Also finding a much needed upgrade station here as well, so I can put some points into upgrading that shotgun. Heading upstairs, I find the building covered in all these little growth things, which I assume is going to be acid. Oh, yep, okay, nope, that's acid. Along with these little assholes crawling around on the ground, which are absolutely going to explode in my face if I get too close. Moving around the area for a bit, I get into combat with a few more groups of enemies, and find myself amazed at how this upgraded shotgun still can't one-shot an enemy at close range, even with a fully charged up shot. Alright, now we're talking. Before then finally finding the key and heading all the way back to that tool store that I was at earlier. Oh yeah, remember how earlier I said this area was going to be where some combat was going to take place? Yeah? Well, I called it. And because I don't want to waste all of my ammo killing these things one by one, it became a matter of herding these things around those explosive barrels, so I can try to take out a bunch of them all at once. You know, saving myself the pain of dealing with them once they've mutated. Where yet again, I need to thank whoever had the foresight to leave these tanks lying around in the open. I mean, that guy's the real MVP. Right, I'll admit, that was pretty cool. Finally, I can get into the tool store where I'm suddenly ambushed by your mum. Which admittedly gave me a fucking heart attack. then baiting this bitch around the shelves to get her to follow me, like I got a Twinkie hanging out of my zipper. Where after all is said and done, I get to collect my grand prize with a pair of bolt cutters.
Of course!
And I make jokes about this in pretty much every single survival horror video I've ever done, but it is so funny to me how much these things pop up in the genre.
Solution achieved.
It's almost kind of like your game doesn't count as survival horror if you don't have a pair of bolt cutters. With these things, I can head back to that apartment and get into the elevator, but then I can also head back and check out one of the side areas, where I immediately find a cat. Yeah, a cat, just standing there.
He's just standing there, menacingly!
And honestly, it wouldn't have surprised me if this thing went all John Carpenter and sprouted tentacles out of its back or something, but instead of that, it just sits there being cute, even letting me pat it before it evaporates and turns into a key. Which then unlocks another side area back at the safe room, which holds a bunch of hidden items. The final area in this demo is more or less just a boss fight against another large creature in this apartment. Having to bait it through different rooms and weaken it with fire, where, yet again, well-placed propane tanks pretty much save the day, forcing this thing to expose its giant weak spots. And I'm sure there's about a dozen things that this could be referencing or influenced from, but what it felt like the most to me is the Ouroboros fight that you have early on in Resident Evil 5. Even in the way it turns into these weird, slippery-looking eel things, and the way it's comprised of all these different nightmarish elements. I mean, visually it's very similar. Plus, just like the Ouroboros, this thing sucked away most of my ammo. Either way though, once it's dead, that's it, and the demo soon comes to an end after, as I tear reality a new asshole and jump into a time rift.
Temporal destination reached.
In all honesty though, like, despite some of the issues I might have had with this thing, I was still pretty damn captivated by Cronos overall, and after finishing the demo, which took me almost exactly 2 hours, all I wanted to do was just go right back in there and play through it all over again.
That's good.
I mean, it is important to also acknowledge that this isn't a big budget AAA game, probably sitting somewhere there in the AA category, which means it's not going to feel as honed or polished as certain other titles. And nowhere near what it looks like we're getting in the upcoming Resident Evil 9, for instance. But as far as survival horror goes, this really does tick pretty much all of the boxes. And on top of that, I'm just so glad that we're getting a new IP in the genre. I mean, yeah, I will admit I'm not entirely in love with how some of the gunplay feels, and that whole mutation aspect still feels a bit undercooked. Not to mention the complete lack of any proper puzzles, outside of just finding an item and then bringing it back to a specific spot, which is a bit of a bummer given how genuinely clever some of the puzzles were in that Silent Hill 2 remake. I don't know, I'm hoping they're just kind of saving that stuff for the final version. At a time when survival horror fans are already eating pretty good though, this thing looks like it'll be another solid entry to shove into your gobs. Either way though, when it finally drops early next month, we'll know for sure.
That's your dumb ass. Bow down to a true pimp, bitch.